Consciousness is a very popular topic, but what exactly does it mean? Since we're going to be diving into this topic, it's important for us to begin with some definitions and some understandings that help us clarify what we are going to be talking about. Consciousness is our basic perception. It's our basic experience from moment to moment. But along with this basic experience, it comes with another quality, which we'll call understanding. So, at any particular moment we're experiencing our life, we have an experience. Our consciousness is experiencing. But that experience, that perception, what we are perceiving, comes along with it an understanding of what that is. What is our current experience? If we have a perception but we don't understand what it is, then we misapprehend that experience. If you don't know what you're experiencing, you can view it or see it as something which it is not, which is something that is not real. The classic example that's placed in the scriptures in Buddhism is perceiving or seeing a coiled up snake in the shadows. But upon closer inspection, it's actually just a rope. So if you could imagine opening up a closet or a shed outside where there isn't much light and you see something in the corner, you respond as if it is a snake. So you perceived something and your understanding was that it was a serpent. But it actually was just a coiled up rope. So this type of misapprehension is constantly occurring in our life. And it's not simply something that happens in relationship to our external world. Obviously, as we go about our life, we can see things and perceive one thing for something else, to misapprehend some impression of life. But more profound than that is the perceptions that we have of our own inner activity. So when we say our own inner activity, we're talking about what is already going on inside of our mind and what is already going on inside of our emotional center. Something that's going on inside of ourselves. Because there's already this, what we can call mental activity. Thoughts, feelings, emotions. Things going on inside of ourselves. And we perceive that as well. So even though it's going on within ourselves, we have the capacity and we are constantly perceiving our inner state. That perception of our inner state, if we misapprehend what's going on inside of ourselves, that is 1,000 times more important and more powerful. And those misapprehensions, those lead us to go to make behaviors and to have further elaborations of thoughts and feelings. Now, this is our basic issue. When the consciousness perceives and understands that perception to be something which it is not. That is the state of a sleeping consciousness. When consciousness perceives in accordance with the actual state of affairs, with reality, that is what we would call an awakened consciousness. But we must understand this not in a binary, homogeneous state. There are aspects of our consciousness. Some parts or aspects or layers are more awake and some other parts are not. In some aspects of our life, we may have more presence, more mindfulness, but when confronted with other types of perceptions and impressions, external or internal, we may have very little capacity to see the truth. Our folly, which we all possess, is that we end up creating a snare, a trap within our own mind. And then we get trapped inside of it. We create our own bondage, our own cage. And this is fundamentally based on these misapprehensions. Because when you see something, when you experience something, and then you respond in accordance with something that is not actually real, then you reinforce a pattern of energy, a pattern of behavior, a pattern of thinking, a pattern of feeling that is not based on the truth. So that misapprehension, then we respond either physically or emotionally or through thoughts. We respond in a way that is not in alignment or not with the truth. So we respond in a way that is a lie, that is false, that is based on ignorance. That application of energy, that behavior places into motion a certain pattern which is going to reinforce itself within our own mind. In a similar way that if you were to walk through the woods, in a very thick part of the woods, every time you walk through that same area over and over again, it actually becomes easier to walk that same path. So every time we apply energy, every time we act, behave, think, feel in a way that is not in accordance with reality, we reinforce a deceptive, dreaming type of ignorance within ourselves, where it becomes easier and easier to go down those paths. So what becomes easy for our mind, what becomes quote-unquote natural, is precisely the thing that's causing us to remain ignorant. Now, ignorance is a very tricky thing, because in the moment of acting that way, it may feel good, it may feel pleasant. It may feel as if we are reinforcing something. We feel a sense of safety because it's familiar. And it's only later on when we have some response to the world appears. We get some negative effect. And because we have a limited capability of connecting the causes with the effects, that we remain confused as to the true source of our suffering. When we don't understand why our life is the way it is, this is a form of suffering. It's different than the form of suffering of someone who's undergone, some kind of painful torture or some type of, sadness because they lost a loved one. Those are also, of course, forms of suffering. But the most pervasive is this type of existential malaise, a type of suffering that is subtle, but simultaneously the deepest and most profound. And it is this basic confusion, confusing the real for the unreal. And this is what it means to have a sleeping consciousness. And this is all of our this is the common problem. This is the common issue. Now, reality is extremely complex and detailed, sophisticated, and so is our capabilities of our consciousness. So it's not easy. But it's important to at least know that there is a way through this and a way out of this. Now, consciousness, obviously we need to have a certain type of education. It's good to learn about some of these ideas and topics. Extremely helpful. Unfortunately, today there's an overload of information. There's such a wide buffet of different places we can go to learn about some things like this. And not all of those places are of equal quality. So it has become difficult to find things that are truly looking without any other motivation, truly looking to awaken, to teach how to do this, to awaken consciousness. But in any case, learning about awakening consciousness is not the same thing as actually awakening. Learning concepts and ideas and being even very inspired by that, it's not awakening. So to have the enthusiasm, well, this can be very good. But having all these ideas in our head means nothing if we don't apply it. The basic fact that we need to reflect upon is that we're constantly in activity. And by this I mean, what's going on inside of ourselves? It's not quiescent. There is activity going on. Thoughts, different variety of thoughts, different streams of thoughts, feelings, emotions, moods. Where is that coming from? And the analysis needs to be profound. Thinking about it won't be enough. So we have to go deeper than that. The intellect cannot awaken the consciousness. It can be of service to this process, but it cannot awaken the consciousness. So, the first half of this lecture, I'm going to present 4 axioms. These are basic statements, which at first may seem quite obvious, but it's important that we understand them in depth. The first axiom, the first statement, is that life is a series of choices. We can summarize that our life is simply that, a successive, moment by moment choosing. Now there is a limitation to this. We have to understand this judiciously. We have some type of choice at every moment of our life. And we need to acknowledge that. Certainly, there are many things about our life which we don't have a choice about. We didn't choose the scenario of our family or where we were born. Many of those situations. We didn't choose it in the sense that we choose, what types of shoes to wear today when we leave the house. According to the doctrine of karma, those situations which we were born in were the result of actions of previous lives. But And talking about this present existence, the stage of our life was already set. So that half of it, we don't have a choice. It's already been set. It's already been chosen. But the other half is moment by moment. What are we going to do with the situation that we're in right now? There's always that type of choice. Now, in this moment, how much choice, or we can say agency to act freely, it varies. Everybody has a different amount based upon where they live and the political factors and whether they have a stable society that they're living in or a chaotic society. Whether they're, in terms of this pandemic, whether we're living under some type of lockdown or restrictions. But those are the external type of things. And again, the real type of choice that we have is internal. Because as some type of restriction is imposed upon us, we have some response internally to it. You may not have a choice as to whether or not somebody is insulting you. That's their will. That's what they did. But you have a choice of how you respond to it. You may not really have a choice of many aspects of your life, but you must recognize that you have a choice in how you respond. It's critical. Because we get locked inside of narratives that remove what little agency we have. We can get locked inside of narratives, ideas, or stories that we've told ourselves or that others have told us about how we may not have any freedom, how certain things are impossible, or we might have just come up with it ourselves. But moment by moment, we have a choice on how to respond. And the ways that we choose to respond need to be in alignment with the highest ethics. So we need to know what our ethical ideals are. All of us have some type of ideal within us, what makes a good person, how we should basically orientate our lives. We may very well believe in them very strongly. But the moment by moment responses that we give to the world, are they in alignment with that? Because it becomes extremely convenient to forget about it, to ignore that. And this is how, one way that we become a hypocrite. This is what we all are guilty of this, because ideals are just that, extremely difficult to uphold. However, it's necessary to have them. It's necessary to try to uphold them. Because when we are dealing with a good ethic, it is our guidance, it is our roadmap, our sign to make that right choice. And we have to reflect, and sometimes we have to revise those ideals, those ethics. But whether or not we consciously revise them, or whether we've never paid attention to them, we're living by something. It may be a narrative that we've never uncovered within ourselves. Because whether or not we're conscious of our own story that we tell ourselves or unconscious of the story we tell ourselves, there's some story. These stories we tell ourselves, generally speaking, are very far from reality. It's so easy to get lost or to tell yourself a story how that, for example, you have been wronged by the world. Or that you have sacrificed too much and no one has recognized the sacrifices you've done, for example, for a family member. or how they've always wronged you, things like this. We tell ourselves those stories. There's some reason why. We have to become conscious of that. We're looking to get something out of it. And these are precisely one way that those patterns of behavior become strengthened. These are patterns. When I say patterns of energy, I just mean, just think of your thoughts as a cycle of energy inside of your mind. And every time we go down the wrong path, we reinforce that pathway. So what becomes wrong becomes easy. That's a terrible situation we find ourselves in. So a lot of times people, when they're not truly reflecting on this, they tell themselves a story that they couldn't have acted in any other way. We couldn't have done anything, anything better. Now, this is not an exercise in self-deprecating ourselves. We just have to uncover the truth, not just listen to the first little story that we tell ourselves. I'm not advocating that you need to replace that story with something else. The fact is, in our current situation, it's just going to be there. Even if we try to get rid of it, we have a story of trying to not have one. But little by little, as we awaken our consciousness, that sort of behavior reduces. And what replaces it is actual presence, awareness, consciousness. Just seeing the reality as it is, without having to place a fabric of what I keep referring to as the narrative. These narratives that we tell ourselves, the stories. Sometimes we call it our psychological song, a sort of song that we always sing to ourselves. When something goes wrong, we might say, why me? This always happens to me. Of course this happened to me on this day. Of course it always happens like this. Little things like that. You have to investigate that impulse. Because right then and there, we're choosing to feed into that. And it doesn't even feel like we're making a choice. It's as if our mind has responded already in that way. And the reason it's responding in that way is that we have conditioned ourselves into that. And we end up behaving in a way that in the beginning it feels like it's a good thing to behave in that way. But in the end, it leads us towards ignorance. So the big choice of our life is, how do we choose to pay attention? And the way that we normally respond to the world may be a very conditioned way. And our choice has to then become to live in accordance with our highest ethic. The next axiom that we'll talk about is that our present condition is not ideal. And this feeds into what I've already been talking about. To say the least, our present condition is not ideal. And this is where a lot of that narrative stuff comes into play. We have to believe, we wouldn't be listening to this lecture if you believed that everything about your life was ideal. So it's sort of an obvious thing. But in which way? If you believe that there's no inner capacity for you to overcome all these problems through an application of your own will, then by definition, you believe yourself to be a victim. We all respond to the world in various ways. Some people are more prone to responding in a way that gets themselves off the hook of their own responsibilities by blaming others for their situation. Now, this is tricky because, again, a lot of the times the situations that we're born into, there's very difficult, very profoundly difficult situations where, in the immediate sense, it doesn't seem like there's any fault of the person who's suffering all of these things. But the core truth that we need to comprehend is that, going back to what I said before, we have an ability in how we wish to respond. And in that sense, it's nobody's fault but ourselves if we feel to be a victim. So if our present condition is not ideal, the thing that goes along with that is that there is some way out of this. There's some way forth, some way through this. And that way is to understand and to apply our consciousness. And that goes into the fourth axiom I'm presenting here, which is that our true nature is consciousness. This is a nice statement, but we have to comprehend it and we have to understand it. We have to experience it. We need to, in a sense, take refuge in the consciousness itself. What this means is, moment by moment, we have impressions of the world. Many of them are very intense. And, for example, reading the news, all these events that are occurring, which could frighten us. And that experience of being frightened, being not sure what's going to happen, is this sense of fear, this lack of security. All of this, for example, is wrapped up in a notion that we don't want to lose what we have. Don't want to feel insecure. Because what we have right now, at least we know what we have, for example. If it were to change, how difficult would that be? We don't want that change. We want the sort of security of this, whatever we have in our life. But the truth is, all of those things could go away at any second, any moment. But we like to orientate our life in a way such that it presents us the types of impressions we enjoy. And those enjoyable impressions bring about thoughts and feelings that are pleasant, that we like. And of course, we don't want the opposite of that. I mean, this is a very simple fact. What's important is that beyond all those impressions, those pleasant sensations, or the opposite of them, the unpleasant sensations, behind all of that is the thing that is perceiving them. Because as much as we like to organize the external world to please ourselves, all of that is just the outer game in order to organize and bring about our internal states, the states of our mind that we want to experience, and to avoid the states of our mind we don't want to experience. And if we can perceive that, what we're perceiving that with is our consciousness. So all of this type of fear of losing something is just to feed something towards our consciousness which lacks understanding. Because if we understood that our true nature is consciousness, then if the whole chessboard of life gets wiped off or gets rearranged, that whole chessboard is still perceived by the same consciousness, which has not fundamentally changed. Now, we need to be, of course, careful. We need to take care of our body and our situation and our life and our family. Shouldn't be stupid, because this physical body that we have and this life that we have is extremely precious. But at the same time, we shouldn't cower in a type of paranoia and fear about things we don't actually have knowledge about. That type of fear is fundamentally related to not knowing, not being conscious of our own true nature, which is that same consciousness. If we're identified with our body, if we're identified with the types of thoughts and feelings that we enjoy, we'll constantly be running around trying to appease those things. Because the states of the mind are very fickle, ephemeral as well. They go away, they change constantly. The world is constantly changing. Things fall apart. So in order to maintain some state of mind based upon external sensations and impressions is a fool's game. But it is exactly what we're doing. Trying to organize the external world. Now again, this is not to be an extremist. Yeah, we need to have some relative stability. We need to be able to make a living, carve out a living in the world. This is all practical reality. We need that, absolutely. But there's no absolute safety in anything like that. We have to recognize that. So because we don't recognize our own true nature, we go around chasing things that have nothing to do with who we truly are, or that are not going to change who we truly are. So what this means is that we identify with something. We use this phrase all the time, but do we understand what it means? To identify means to place your identity into something which it is not. To identify with something. Now, the easiest type of example is to identify with money, for example, with wealth, with a nice suit, or to be smartly dressed, with a new haircut, to be identified with physical appearance, for example, to be identified with the prestige of having a certain title. But once again, all those things that we want to identify with, they're all the external. That's all the external aspect, and all of them have an internal aspect that we firstly identify. We firstly identify with a certain mental configuration, a certain mental state we want to have. We identify with that mental state, and then we act in the physical world in such a way in order to sustain that internal mental state. That desire or need to maintain that internal mental state is because we are identified with the mental state. But we're not the mental state. The mind is not the consciousness. The thoughts that we have is not consciousness. That in of itself may be vague if this is the first time you hear that. But the simple exercise is to observe your thoughts. And if you have thoughts without a willful intention to have those thoughts, then who had them? You will find if you observe your mind in that way that thoughts come and go and change. But your consciousness perceives. In this sense, we could say it perceives without changing. It is that sort of absolute, that constant. If you spend a lot of time in meditation, you become more and more knowledgeable of your true nature. So this is why, for example, meditation is so important. But it's not simply meditating once or twice. You don't learn how to become a good swimmer just by being in the pool once or twice. So little by little, if you meditate, if you become self-aware and self-observant, you can see these things emerging, these activities that are emerging from some murky place within us. And so what's actually happening is all these patterns of behaviors whenever we act in a certain way that's unconscious, that sort of stamps onto our mind and sort of locks the consciousness in a way that when similar impressions appear again in life, that pre-programmed or priorly conditioned state of consciousness hops up to the front again and just repeats what happened before. And if we enjoy that type of mental state, then we want to try to put those impressions in front of our mind again so that the mind gets into that state again. And of course, the opposite is also true, that if it's a state of mind we don't enjoy, then we want to sort of figure out how to avoid that. But the person who's looking to awaken their consciousness recognizes their mental states, recognizes that the pleasant ones and the unpleasant ones are both based upon an unreality, a lie. They're both based upon an ignorance. That ignorance is to posit or to identify with a state of mind as being oneself. That state of mind which is temporary, which has no center, has no core. It comes together through a weaving of factors of external world with our internal world, and some state of mind appears for some moments, and later on it will go away and be replaced with a different state of mind, a different emotion. If we identify with that, which is what we're doing moment by moment, we're just reinforcing all of these patterns of behaviors which are based upon, again, ignorance. So to know that our true nature is consciousness is extremely important. We may know it now, you may believe in what I'm saying intellectually, but to know it factually, to perceive it and understand it, that has to be done through an application of consciousness. So this is why our fourth statement is awakening is our highest function. It's our highest function because to awaken the consciousness is to be perceiving the world and understanding it in accordance with reality. Now, there's different, we can say, levels of reality. We have our physical reality, we have our mental and emotional reality, and we have the reality of our true nature. And that reality of our true nature is that we are consciousness. Now, if you are well experienced with that nature of your own consciousness, that goes very far in being able to shatter some of these patterns of our mind. And these tightly woven patterns of energy in our mind we call the ego. But it's not just one thing, it's all of these intersecting, interwoven knots of energy that all sort of pull and tug on each other. And this is when we feel that. We can feel those sort of tuggings and contradictions within ourselves. Because every one of these little egos that we have is they're not in harmony with each other. They're just all in chaos. Because all these little egos that we have, they're all based upon different variations of a lie, different types of lies. We may, for example, at one moment believe that, like I said before, we have been wronged by the world. blaming others. And then someone may come with a bad attitude and then tell us that actually it's all our own fault. And then we'll switch into a different ego of self-hatred and say, oh, you're right, I'm a terrible person. And then later on we flip back to the other side. Both of those things play on each other, and they're both based upon fundamentally mistaken or confusion of what is our true reality. They're fundamentally mistaken. This is why in Buddhism Buddhism is an extremely vast set of schools and scriptures, but fundamentally at its core, always talking about what is the nature of self. And it's often quoted as being that there is no self in Buddhism. Well, the more intricate forms of those teachings go back and say some things about a consciousness, a light of consciousness, which is, by all means, a sort of is our true self, although they wouldn't use those words. We call it the consciousness, the perceiver. We need to experience, we need to apply our consciousness, because right now we have these negative patterns of energy, which are our egos, but we also lack understanding. And we get understanding through our experience and unpacking our experiences and comprehending our experiences. And we develop the understanding of things that are closer to reality. So the closer we get to our reality, the more we awaken our consciousness, the more we can start behaving in ways that are not going to tighten down our own chains, and instead begin to remove these conditions. So for the next part of this lecture, we're going to talk about what it means to be asleep in more detail. The what, the why, and the how. So what does it mean that we are asleep? As basically, I've already answered this question. It means that we don't perceive reality as it is. We misunderstand it. In a practical sense, when we go through our daily life, moment by moment, things are happening. We have what we call the impressions of our life flowing, a flow of impressions. And if we're physically awake, then it's all the sensory organs, all these impressions are coming in. What's happening as in a response to that are many things which are unconscious to us. Automatic responses. And again, this goes back to that sense of choice. It doesn't feel like we're choosing to think a certain way, choosing to feel a certain way. But the stronger we feel about something, the more concrete that we have some notion within ourselves of, let's say, righteousness. Exactly right there is the key flag that we need to recognize. Where did this come from? Such a powerful onslaught of thinking. Such a powerful onslaught of some emotion just gets us, for example, we use the term getting fired up. Where is that The basic lie we tell ourselves is that that other person, that other situation, that is where this anger that I'm feeling, that's where it exists. It's a basic lie. The experience, those sensations are or whatever they are, they're out there. It is our mind that we have conditioned in such a strong sense that it responds unconsciously before we even perceive it. We may be already thinking and feeling in a certain way. And it feels so concrete, it feels so real, it feels so connected to that external impression that we lazily and sleepily just attribute that negative essence to the external world. But if we're awake, if we're aware, we'll see that the impression coming from the outside world causes a sort of reaction, like a chemical reaction. And that fire, that chemical reaction within us, and we're using an analogy here, that we respond in that way. And the mental states that we have and the emotional states that we have actually then do feed into our neurological state. Our nervous system then actually puts certain chemicals into our body. We have words today called very popular ways of contextualizing our state of a mind is stress, anxiety, depression. Those are big words we use today. Stress, anxiety, depression. But stress and anxiety are just really words that are replacing a very simple word called fear. Being afraid. What is it that we are stressed out about? We're not able to accomplish some goal. We're not able to appear in some way in front of people. We're not able to do something. What if something happens? To be afraid. Again, what is that fear of? Ultimately, what is the fear of? Losing something that we possess externally? Losing something that we possess, a certain mental state internally that we are attached to, we're identified with. We find ourself in that thing, but that thing, whether it's external or internal, it can't be sustained forever. So we're afraid that it might go away. And if it goes away, then what becomes of me? So we're asleep. It means that we are chasing a reality that doesn't exist. We are identified with the self that has no permanence. There is relative self, or we have our personality, and we have all these egos, and we have this sort of narrative that we put over all of these different wills and actions and behaviors and thoughts and feelings, and that's who we are. And when someone says our name, we respond. But where's the consciousness in all of that? That thing that responds, that thing that talks, and later on we don't even remember what we said. We didn't realize we said something because we're unconscious, because we're asleep. And all this activity that continues on even when we place our physical body asleep. Something continues. Some type of activity continues even when our physical body is asleep. That activity is now no longer impinged upon the constant impressions of the sensations of the external world. So what happens is sort of the will, the actions of our consciousness become totally identified with just the inner mental content. And then the dreams occur. But what's more than that is that we become so asleep that we don't even perceive the dream. So the dream occurs, but then we don't even perceive it. So we have a total blackout of perception. It's common to perceive a dream, but not understand it. And again, there's that two sides of perception and understanding. To perceive a dream is better than to have total unconsciousness of it. But then when you perceive it, you may be presented with something that seems incomprehensible. So then to understand it is another thing. So we filter and we condition the impressions of life. In a very practical sense, the way that we start is to begin to be aware of what's going on moment by moment in our life. And to again, be aware enough to make a choice of how to behave. To be present enough to see what's going on within ourselves. So we are asleep, but why does it occur? Fundamentally, we are confused. We have confusion. If we were not confused, then we would be able to perceive things accurately. But there is some type of necessary work that we all have to do in order to possess wisdom. We're not born with the innate wisdom, with an innate wisdom. We're born with an innate capacity to perceive. We're born with an innate capacity to choose and have willful action to some degree. But the correct understanding, to have that wisdom, is something we develop. This is the development of our capacities. In the same way that a baby doesn't know that the thing it's looking at in front of itself is its own hand. An infant has to come into contact with that knowledge, eventually understands that this thing in front of me is my own hand. In the same way, we need to come into contact with our own self, recognize that this emotion that I'm feeling is a projection of my own self. And it's something not based upon this moment and the facts of this moment, but based upon a traumatic experience I had many years ago. A pattern of behavior that I've hid myself within in order to protect myself from some harsh reality I was incapable of comprehending in the past. So fundamentally, it is part of the human condition that we have to struggle with this. But the degree to which we have fallen asleep and created such confusion within ourselves is not necessary. So we have to work to remove this confusion. And again, this occurs through a special willful application of our own consciousness. Even though the consciousness right now is mostly asleep, there's still some capability there. Just like if you were caught in a current of water that's strong, much stronger than you can swim. You may not be able to swim against the current, but you may be able to swim a little bit across. And by applying that ability in a certain way, you can get yourself out of that troubling situation. But if you didn't understand how to do that, you would just be swimming against the current. You wouldn't be able to get anywhere. In the same way, we have consciousness and we have a little bit free, available to us. But we have to know how to apply it. If we don't know how to apply it, nothing's going to happen positive. All of the momentum of our mind, these currents, are just going stronger and stronger to condition ourselves more and more. And the more we are conditioned, the more we suffer. The more that we are conditioned, the less we possess the ability to have a peaceful state of mind at any particular time that we wish. We're constantly assaulted by our own mental states, though this is suffering. And this is because we are highly conditioned. But we shouldn't become just upset about that, because the good news is that there's a way through this. We're not saying this in order to make anyone feel bad. There's a way through this, and that's why we're having this lecture. The fundamental thing is that we are confused. We attribute characteristics of things falsely. We attribute certain characteristics onto ourself. What is the nature of ourself? We view that in a false way. We identify with our thoughts and our feelings. We think that's our real self when it's not. We put characteristics upon things and people and situations in life which are not true. Unless we become aware and be very critical, very present, then all of those false attributions, they just start happening automatically, mechanically. So a lot of times we'll attribute things based upon one of these narratives that we hold, and it's a lazy, sleeping way of sort of understanding the world. Instead of seeing things as they are, you experience some fact, some moment of reality, and you interpret that fact in accordance with a narrative that you already enjoy. And we see this so strongly with, religious factions and political factions, where a basic reality is not being seen. Everything's being interpreted in accordance with a narrative. Nothing's being questioned at that level. But the biggest story we tell ourselves is something to do with our own self. We have to uncover the narrative that we tell ourselves. So that fundamental characteristic is that we posit the existence of a substantially real self that does not exist. This self that we just carry around, whether we've thought about it or haven't thought about it, we carry a sense of self with us at every moment. But if we look into those characteristics which we think we have, that it's our real self, if you untie it, they all just fall apart. And at the core of all that is just wind. There's nothing there. After you unwind all of your emotions and you unwind all of your thoughts, what's left? Nothing is left of that self that you thought you had. But there's something, which is that perception and that understanding. But ask yourself for moment by moment, where is this emotion coming from? So, for example, if someone offends you, I always go back to this example because it's probably one of the easiest to illustrate if someone just insults you or offends you. You have to locate where the pain is coming from. Because the first thing we do wrongly is to locate it as if it came from the person. But it doesn't come from the person. It comes from us. It comes from within. It is an expectation that was not met, and we are attached to a certain mental state that we don't get. So if something happens that we're offended because a mental state has come apart and another one has been replaced that we don't like, and we blame the other person for it. So you have to critically analyze, where's the pain coming from? What I is hurt? The letter I in quotation mark. What ego is hurt? Where's this activity coming from? And what are the characteristics of this ego? So all of this mental activity occurs. And we confuse that mental activity with our true self. We think that intense mental activity is oneself. This isn't to say that there's no relationship at all, but we become totally identified with this strong mental activity. Because we all have ego, and there will be some moment today or tomorrow where you have a strong response. The point here isn't to say, oh, I guess I have a big ego, I shouldn't feel this way. No, that's not what's supposed to happen here. You're supposed to investigate with astonishment. How is it possible that this strong response came out of me and I never even intended it to happen? You have to have a sense of awe and astonishment and look critically with presence. Not to judge it as morally good or bad. That's a waste of time at this juncture. To see where it's coming from. The same way that someone would observe an animal in its own habitat, see what it does. Where does it come and where does it go? So, as I've stated several times in this lecture, just to reiterate, the remedy to all of this is a willful application of consciousness. A particular willful activity, which is to be observant. That the way out of this is through our consciousness. Observing, viewing, perceiving, understanding. This implies, as we're going to talk about, becoming self-aware, self-observant, meditation. But know that what we are presenting here is that the medicine for our suffering is within our consciousness. That medicine may not taste good, and it will often be bitter, but it's there. Finally, the correct application of consciousness can remove the negative elements which presently condition it. So we have this present conditioned state of consciousness. It is asleep. It responds in automatic ways which are not in accordance with reality. And that reinforcement, every time that we act in those ways, it reinforces those patterns, which reinforces our conditioning. And whenever we act in a way that's not in accordance with reality, we act based upon ignorance, based upon a lie, whatever you want to call it, that leads to suffering. That's basically it. So these general statements are simple, are basic. They may even be easily accepted. But what they're implying, the activity of our consciousness as they're implying, it's difficult. If it was easy, we wouldn't be in the current state of the world that we're in. So let's view our life as a continuous flow. We have a continuous flow of life. As I was saying before, we have streams of impressions. We have streams of mental states. We have streams of the response, of instinct, emotion, thought, volition, physical actions. The streams of impressions, this is implying the sensory experiences that we're having moment by moment. You know, how interesting it is that something is happening outside of us. Just those sensory experiences, because we don't like it, someone cuts in front of us in line when we've been waiting for a long time. There's some response. And if we're feeling very arrogant that day, then that response may be very strong. But all it was a bunch of information, just sensory information, that gets interpreted and understood in accordance with something that brings upon that mental state that it then brings out. The impression then brings out some mental state within us. Then some aspect of our ego doesn't like that mental state. And then the response occurs. So, of course, in practical reality, maybe the person who cut you in line, maybe they didn't realize. Maybe there's a charitable interpretation of those events and you could talk to that person or something. But certainly the thing to do is not to yell at them or to get secretly angry. Why not have compassion for somebody who acts ignorantly? Why isn't our innate reaction to be, compassionate? This is not the same thing as being being run over and being a doormat. This is different. You have to understand that when someone acts in a way that's obviously ignorant, well, then they're suffering. That's suffering on display. And sometimes the right response is not always to be flowery and compassionate in some, typically, associated way. Sometimes compassion comes with stern words. So we have to understand what I'm saying here. The main point of what I'm getting at is that the streams of impressions interact with the streams of mental states that we have. And our reactions to the world is always the direct thing it's reacting to is not the external data of the world. It is the mental state that has been brought up in response to the external world. Because, how often does it happen, for example, that you interpret a certain experience in the wrong way and then have a situation based upon a completely wrong interpretation of events. And later on, you find out that you just interpreted it completely wrong. That's a very sort of obvious way that our response was not the external event, but the way we responded to the mental state that appeared. So it's important for us to, take that example and realize it happens in very subtle ways. Very subtle ways. So we like to talk about streams of impressions because it's just like that. It's a continuous flowing state. And we have these streams of mental states where we have thoughts that are many times ongoing, going on and on and on. And the same with the emotional states, flowing. And one stream flows into the other stream. And then we have our responses. So with all of that, we like to talk about self-observation. So observing or practicing self-observation is, in the beginning, it's very difficult because it's just like beginning to, if you've never run a marathon, if you just try running a marathon one day out of nowhere, you're not going to have a good time. But if you train, it's completely possible. In the same way with self-observation, when you first begin to practice this, it can feel very difficult. But it is something that we develop. We work on it. And the basic thing is, observe the external, observe the internal, observe the responses. What we're looking for here is practice, not perfection. Just practice it. Don't worry about being perfect. Our ethical ideal is to work towards, always being in accordance with reality and awakening our consciousness. But moment by moment, just do your best. Just start observing those things. And then you at least have the sort of capability to steer. You may not be very good at it, but at least you can try to steer the way that you're responding and the way that you're behaving in the world. Then you begin to actually use some of that little agency, that little bit of choice that you actually have. You can actually use it. If you're not observant to these things, then you really have no choice anywhere. Then you're just a total slave to all of these activities. You're just along for the ride. A basic fundamental practice that we often talk about is called SOL, the key of soul, we call it sometimes. Soul is in reference to the sun, to the light of our consciousness. And it's very simple: subject, object, location. So we can kind of combine this with what I was saying before, with the external, the internal, and our reactions. We can also look at this as observing the subject, which, what is the subject of our observations? It's us, it's me, it's myself, it's I. What's going on? Are you aware? You know, the moment you enter into a room and someone's talking to you, are you aware of yourself? Are you aware of what's going on? Observe the object, which is what you're interacting with. Someone, if you're talking to a person, if you're dealing with something, what your immediate things are that you're dealing with. You observe the object because there are characteristics that we ignore. And particularly, if you become very good at this, you start doing this activity even in your dreams. And when you start observing well in your dreams, you'll observe that the objects that you deal with sometimes don't really make sense. You may have something in your possession that doesn't make sense in the physical world. And that itself can be a sort of way of becoming aware, awake in that sense. And a location as well. Observe the characteristics and the details of your environment. Observe, your location. What's happening? Where are you? What is this? Be aware of it. Again, if you do that a lot, if you really practice this moment by moment, it becomes embedded in a sense, and you can even do it. It will spontaneously occur in your dreams. And of course, that is a direct experience when you awaken in your dreams, of awakening some aspect of your consciousness. Often the environments that we're in our inside of our dreams, they don't make any sense. But we have to, when we're in our dreams, the part of our self that can relate and sort of connect cause and effect is very asleep. But when we somehow awaken that, then we realize, well, why am I in this environment? I don't live near here. I'm halfway around the world, or I'm in some place that I was, 10 years ago. That is an awakening of your consciousness, a realization. So these are techniques for awakening. We combine this daily type of being observant and mindful with exercises of meditation. And the more mindful that we are during the day, the better our meditations are, and vice versa. The more we can become deeper in our meditations, the more we can sort of have a basis of consciousness in our daily life. They are two halves of the same coin that we need to practice. Particularly with meditation, you review these impressions, all this activity of your mind. You can review it in depth within meditation. And whether or not you're sort of retrospectively reviewing the day, or you're just going into the activity of your mind at that moment in meditation, that skill is the same skill of observing yourself in the physical world or during your daily life. So we awaken our consciousness by applying our consciousness. Now, this is possible because, like I said, we still have some minor amount of our consciousness which is not completely conditioned. And that little bit is able to sort of bootstrap ourselves into freeing more and more of our mind, more and more of we're freeing our consciousness of these egotistical mental elements. So just like when we respond to the world in a way that's not based upon the truth, that imposes a pattern of energy within our mind. That pattern of energy, the consciousness misidentifies and becomes fascinated with that pattern of energy. It believes that pattern of energy to be itself. So therefore we are identified with our own ego. We are trapped within that identification. And that's why we say the ego is trapped. That's why we say the consciousness is trapped in the ego. This is the analogy of the genie in the lamp. If we know how to get the genie out of the lamp, then all the capabilities, the capacities, the freedom of our consciousness becomes known and possible. Meditation is the most critical aspect of this. Of course, in combination with daily life, supporting it, but we really need that meditation. Because in meditation, in one particular meditation session, you can sort of get some amount or complete amount of your consciousness temporarily out of the ego. And that's like a profound, beautiful experience, capability. Because the more free consciousness you have, the more the ability you have to have perception, to see things deeper within yourself. And when you're able to do that, then you can work with ways of permanently sort of eliminating these egotistical structures. Therefore, it's not just a temporary liberation in a meditation session, but becomes an actual, real liberation. We'll end there and open up to questions and answers.
What I'm wondering about is if you would speak a little bit on balancing the order and chaos. And sometimes life can be very confusing or seem confusing. And there's this idea of planning, creating your day, even listing things out, even including meditation times. But there's also this sort of beautiful improvisation to being led from, by God, from thing to thing. And it seems that there's a balance between these, because I may be meditating and experiencing things, but I also maybe forget that I have an appointment, or and vice versa, or get too caught up in the making of appointments as a way of sort of fearful security or structure. I'm just wondering if you might speak on the balance of those.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, we need to be practical, because the reality is we still have a lot of work to do, and we're going to forget things. So let's not be fanatical. We need to live a balanced life, and if that means we need to organize some aspect of our life, that's the case. We need to have some type of organization and just mundane plans. We don't need to get caught up in a sort of idea that making a list of things that we need to get done for the week is somehow wrong. That's not the problem at all. Now, if someone is obsessively doing that, then that might be a problem. But all of us, we need to make it in the world, and that might mean that we have a lot of responsibilities at work or dealing with our family, and certain things need to happen with certain times. And if they don't, then we're being irresponsible. So yeah, just make the plans, do what you need to do. And also, it's probably a good idea for a lot of us to try to structure in meditation, because that's where we're at. We need the structure. Just like, children usually need more structure. We just need it. So be practical. If it works, if it has some good results, then do it. That's all. I have a chat question. Question is, I wanted to know if and how you can measure if one is making progress, i.e., how awake now versus before. Of course, yes. Well, what are the results of a more awakened consciousness? And what are the results of less awakened consciousness? That's really what it comes down to. I will say that sometimes there's sort of a fog. This is part of our own condition of suffering, is that when we take up the ideal that we want to awaken our consciousness, there's a bit of a difficulty there because we're placing this idea in our head, and then we're interpreting everything in accordance with that. But it's sort of inevitable. And sometimes we don't see the ways that we're changing for the positive. And also the opposite happens. Because we believe we're on this spiritual path, we don't see how much worse we've become in some other way. So the only true and honest answer to that is by observing our day-to-day life and seeing if we're truly changing in those positive ways. But generally speaking, if we have more of our life that is aware and present, and less times where we feel so pulled and strung by life and pushed and pulled in different ways, then that would indicate less amount of that conditioned consciousness. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is that we can't, because we have so much confusion, it's hard for us to see it until, years go by. That we see like definitive change where you look at your life from 5 years from now and you say, I acted much differently then. I definitely have more presence and awareness now. But if you try to measure today versus last week or last month or even last year, sometimes it's hazy. So you have to have you have to be a little patient with that. It's more when you have to look back like years sometimes. Because even when you look back, I made a difference, I made a change, and unfortunately some habit or response or something comes up, it rears its ugly head again, and you realize you still have a lot of work to do in that situation. So it's difficult. But the main thing is to just keep ahead, keep moving forward, and keep reflecting, keep meditating. It's a good question to have. It's a good thing to reflect on exactly that. But the ultimate answer is that only our consciousness can make that assessment. Another question. How exactly does memory aid us in awakening our consciousness? Well, the memory of the mind is very fickle and subjective. A truly, completely, fully awakened consciousness has access to all of his experiences. The type of memory that we are associated with, or that we kind of know of, is very fallible. But obviously, if in deeper meditation, you can have access to something that presently we don't have access to. That's not to say that our sort of ordinary memory has no use. It does. And in fact, this sort of ties in with the previous question. There's something we call work memory, which is just recognizing and remembering who you were, what type of person you were in the past. That actually gives you a knowledge that the work that you're doing on yourself has helped. And things are changing. So memory, in a normal sense, we have to, we should, as we awaken more and more consciousness, our memory works better, just our ordinary memory, because we're more present. There's more light present within our mind, and the memories are saved stored with more of that light there, so we can remember things much clearer. But ultimately, totally liberated and free consciousness has like complete access to all the experiences that it's had. So I guess that's what I would say about memory. Another question, can you speak more to the idea that one should not be a doormat and that at times compassion is not delivered kindly or gently? In reality, sometimes people are intentional in harming us, and sometimes we cannot avoid those interactions. That's a good question. And I think that's the gist of it. A lot of it is right there. That there are people who at certain times are intentionally trying to hurt us, and we should not allow that to happen. You know, if physical harm, of course, we should protect ourselves. But we also need to investigate how afraid we are, because there's some people who are very afraid all of the time that at any moment someone's going to come in and harm them, and they have a paranoia. And they may have had experiences as a kid, they may have had experiences in war, or as a first responder where their mind has been traumatized and they're always on the lookout. And that's a particular type of situation where they need to work. It's very difficult type of trauma there. But for the types of things, if someone's trying to intentionally, emotionally manipulate us. So we're not talking about physical, but more mentally, emotionally. And we all do this to each other. We have intentions that we just want to get back. It depends on how is it going to affect your practical reality. We need to act judiciously and consciously. That's, I think, the best way to answer that. If you think of if a child was very upset at you and they were saying bad things to you, you can just see the fury in that child's mind and that child's heart. But you can also see like there's something going wrong here. This kid is just in a bad state. It shouldn't really affect you because you have compassion or you see sort of like the situation. But that same type of behavior in someone who's now an adult, we have a harder time seeing it that way. So a lot of times we think, well, I can't be a doormat, but we believe truly and totally that what they're doing is offending us so deeply that we can't let it go on. But it's just, in those senses, it's just our ego that's being offended. There's actually there's no real bad thing going on. Contrary, if there's actually physically in our practical reality, like, someone's making an accusation against us and law enforcement's going to get involved or something like that. Well, yeah, you have to act correctly. Defend yourself and do what you have to do so that don't be a fanatic. Practical reality is complicated sometimes. But even when we need to defend ourselves, the source of it is from compassion. I think that's what I have to say about that. Does our time in retrospection take us away from present awareness? It's a good question, because we have a choice, as I said throughout the lecture. We have a choice of what we pay attention to. Particularly in our present condition, we have such a little bit amount of consciousness that when we focus on one thing, we lose awareness of something else. So retrospection takes us away from this present moment, and we go into what happened, in the past, in order to, extract the wisdom from those past experiences. And this is good. This is what we need to do. Just like when you go into meditation, you selectively, place your attention within and exclude or no longer pay attention to the external world. so that all of your awareness goes within. And that's what we want to do because we want to apply all of our attention within. So there's different types of, we can say, mindfulness or awareness. One type, which is more popular, which is it's good, is just to be totally open and aware and mindful of everything we can be at any moment. But that's just one aspect of that, of practicing with our consciousness. We need to, take our consciousness and take all of the light of our consciousness and reduce it to a single beam of light at times, like a laser, in order to penetrate into our ego, to go deeper. And that's why in meditation we do that, why we reflect within.
So the question is, are certain dynamics given to me from the divine to look at my egos?
Yeah, we can say that divinity is, in certain senses, can help organize the things that we work on. Certain things appear in front of us at certain times. The basic reality is that if it appears within our perception, then we should see it for what it is, understand it. And if you ask, for example, for comprehension, for assistance in understanding something, and then later on something appears in front of you in your mind, in your consciousness, you may not recognize that the reason that's appearing is because of what you asked for, because it's not in accordance with what you thought you needed to see. So the short answer to that is yes, things can happen that way.
And we have another question here. I'm going to paraphrase the question,
Okay.
But essentially it's somebody's coming out of an abusive relationship, and they want to know what they can do to get themselves back in a sense, in a space of normality, psychologically speaking.
Yeah. Relationships, abusive relationships, which, can be of different types. I would say, in essence, it's no different than anything than what we all need to do, which is reflect on what our life is, what's happened in our life. That's the basic advice. Is whether or not it was a very extreme moment or chapter of our life or not. We always have to reflect and learn as much as we can from it. We do have some practices. We have certain practice with the rose flower bush. We have some instructions for that online. That's a certain type of practice that helps you emotionally heal from trauma. And, in particular, when we have traumas, it's basically a knot of energy that's so tightly wound within us that it even getting close to it within, if we try to remember certain things or we observe certain things, it comes so forcefully that it captures us so profoundly that we become paralyzed by it. And it feels like the only thing that happens when you try to access that is just more pain. And it just wraps itself up even tighter. That's sort of the nature of that. And in order to work with that, a lot of prayer and reflection for assistance and getting through that, those types of situations, the memories, the impressions that are related to that, we have to accept that it may take years of work little by little. We don't need to try to eliminate all of that today. It's not going to happen. That's unfortunately just the way it happens. We work on it little by little, because even a drip of water will find a pathway through a stone. And little by little, we recarve and remove these things little by little. But practice like that, for example, I just posted in the chat a link to that magic of the rose, as we call it, that can help sort of place a balm a little bit on that pain and help heal it a little bit so that we can work on it a little bit. We still need to comprehend it and understand it. But when things are so traumatic that even trying to look at it is so difficult, then things like the Magic of the Roses is a good practice for that. Okay, so we have some more chat questions. In reoccurring events, what's the difference between trying to do better in the similar situation and running away from reoccurrence because you already know that the last time the outcome was bad? The running away is the key here. Running away can take place physically, but it also takes place internally, mentally. When we place blame falsely upon something, or in a mechanical way, that's a sort of running away internally from actually looking at it. Events in life occur, and sometimes there are certain situations that we haven't had a good track record in dealing with certain things, and yet they keep happening because that's our life. We can't get out of it. You can't physically run away from it. Well, we have to just do our best. I know sounds like a platitude, but every time it happens, you reflect again and you keep working on it. So there is some situations, if we know we are so internally volatile that we can't control ourselves from saying something really hurtful or bad, then yeah, go for a walk. Try to walk away from that situation because you know that you're not ready for it. That's totally good, but don't leave it at that. Keep working on it, because it does make it worse to take that internal and then say it physically or do it physically. Then it just reinforces it even more. So if you have a situation where it's okay for you to, take a walk or try just to avoid that situation in the here and now, that's fine. But know that that's just a temporary thing. That's just a Band-Aid. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that's good to sort of not encounter a certain situation if you know for sure you can't handle it. Yeah, so just be judicious and take it in context of the full work, which is that eventually you do have to deal with it. Okay, so a follow-up question to the divine. Are certain situations in life given to us from the divine to look at our egos? Yeah, that is the case. That we have karma, which is a topic we didn't really get into too much detail here. But the way that works is we have a lot of situations that are going to occur in our life at certain times because that's what we are owed. And divinity can organize that a little bit and present certain situations at certain times or at a different time, depending on how we're working. You can't avoid it altogether, but sometimes you can have a better time to experience that or a worse time. So yes, there's a sort of organization there. Okay. I think that's all the questions for now. We're going to do a basic meditation. A lot of people really have a terrible time even attaining a basic level of concentration. And we need to be able to get there reliably. Just a basic level of concentration. Because that gives us the real launching point for actual meditation itself. But it also provides a type of immediate relief from this crazy world that we live in. But if we don't have a way of getting there, just saying relax and settle the mind, for most people, that's just not something that we're ready to do, we're able to do. So this practice here is a very simple, but I find it to be quite effective practice. And it's simply counting the breath, but in a particular way. And you can see here on the slide a bunch of series of numbers. And you basically are counting series of numbers. First you count, to one breath, and then you count to 2 breaths, starting over again. Then you start another series where you count to 3, and then you start another where you count to 4, and then 5, then 6, then 7. You go all the way up to 10, and then you go back down. So what this does is that you relax, close your eyes, become aware of the sensation of breathing, of the actual air going through your nostrils. And as you exhale, you mentally say to yourself, 1. And then, because the first set is just 1, you start over again, but you would say 2, 1. And then the next breath would be 2, 2. Then the next breath would be 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 4, 2, 4, 3, 4, 4. You just say that number to yourself mentally. And what this is doing, this is like a little rope that you can hold on to when you are in the midst of a whirlpool. And it's something for you to hang on to, because what happens with our mind, it's like this spinning whirlpool. And because of the way our mind works, we are actually the one creating the whirlpool, even though we don't want to. Unconsciously, we're feeding into it, while consciously we don't want to. But because we're generally unskilled in doing that, we need an exercise like this to help. So when we place our attention on the breath, and we sort of place our intellect and attention on this counting exercise, the unconscious activity that's reinforcing this whirlpool begins to lessen. And we actually start to build up concentration that's conscious. So this is like a little life preserver. It keeps us afloat, keeps us above the waters. Because what will happen for most people who are unskilled, who are not really good at meditation, they'll try to just settle the mind. And what happens is they get caught up in the mind immediately, because we're just not used to having our consciousness be present of the mind without getting identified with the mind. So what this is doing is that we are, instead of allowing that to happen, we're intentionally paying attention to the counting and sensations of the breath. And that gives an opportunity for that whirlpool of our mind to settle down. So, very basic exercise. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. Your breath should be relaxed. The pace the pace of your breathing should be totally natural, whatever that means. Because as you relax more, you will begin to naturally breathe at a slower rhythm. Your intention in this practice is not to complete it. Your intention is to pay attention to the breath and count them. If you try to complete this, you will ruin it. You get to the end whenever you get to the end. But if you try to kind of go through it, you're ruining the practice. So you have to sort of relax a lot and get rid of the goal. The goal is not to complete it. The goal is to have a more concentrated, peaceful state of mind. So if you put a goal in your head that you want to get to the end, you're sabotaging the practice. When you complete one sort of series, this pyramid, you have a choice to either rest and just bear awareness, viewing your mental states with your consciousness, or if you find that you can't sustain that because you just fall into the whirlpool again, repeat the practice. So if you take the entire meditation session just doing this practice, that's good. If it means at the end you're more concentrated and at peace. Because one series of this may give you, 10% more calm mind. Well, if you do it again, it should calm down more. We have to have that patience to just do it. So let us adopt a comfortable position to sit in. You can lie down if you wish. We just don't want to fall asleep. It's preferable that you close your eyes, but if you find that it's too difficult to do the counting with your eyes open, with your eyes closed, you can open them. That might help you stay concentrated. But with your eyes closed, you'll probably get more relaxed. And if you can, breathe through your nose. If you have problems with that, breathe through your mouth. And then on every exhalation, you just say that number. So your first exhalation would be 1, 1. Then you would start at 2, 1. Then 2, 2. And you just gently move through that. And then when you get all the way up to 10, 10, then you go back down, you do the 9s, and then the 8s, and then the 7s. And eventually you'll find yourself back at 1, 1. And at that moment, you can just sort of let go and just be present, be aware, be mindful of everything, of the mental content. And you can at that point make the choice to repeat the practice. Okay, so let's begin. Okay. We will end there. Come back to your senses. Open your eyes. That will be the conclusion of our session today. I wish you all a very happy remainder of the day, and until next time, take care.